How to approach Capstone for game development students. As the title implies, this is a guidance video for those of you participating in Capstone from the game development program, where I hope to give you some advice as to what you can expect and how to prepare for the different aspects that you may not be familiar with. Now, I'd like to preface this video by saying that, as university students, I fully expect you to have a grasp of the technical aspects of game development and have no trouble implementing them to create a product. The GDW program should have provided you with ample experiences to understand development cycles, frameworks, and skill acquisition, so the technical aspects will not be discussed at length here. Instead, I'm here to assist more in the aspects that, while may have been touched on in business classes, have never been tested in a live environment with external forces from the university. How do you handle when not only are you working for someone else's goals, but someone that may not even be related to the school at all? I'll be discussing how to meet with your team members in a Capstone environment, prepare for your first meeting with your client, the information you need to walk out of that meeting with, and the steps you might need to take afterwards to ensure that your 12 weeks goes by as smoothly as possible. I would like to make note that some teams may have students from outside of game development joining them for Capstone, which can be somewhat awkward for both parties involved. I've made sure to highlight where a disconnect can occur, but the main goals of the team shouldn't change. You are working together to create a product, and talking with each other will ensure that there's no misunderstandings. The more you understand what everyone is capable of, the more confident you'll feel in giving out workloads and working together. With all of that out of the way, let's get on with the show. How do you assess your own skills and capabilities to understand what you are able to deliver within the 12 weeks given? Understanding your team's potential and skill sets prior to meeting with the client is something easily overlooked and forgotten, which can lead to a lack of understanding and preparedness for when the client first arrives. To ensure that you are all on the same page, set up a meeting with your team before meeting with your client to establish a baseline understanding of who you all are and how you can all contact each other. If your team has members from outside of game development, this process is crucial to ensure that you are able to meet up with these members and collect their contact information and availability. They may be as anxious as yourselves to be working with others outside of their program, so be polite and take initiative to get the ball rolling. Next, establish what each team member brings to the table in terms of skills, experiences, and background knowledge. Knowing what your team is capable of is crucial for establishing a solid connection with your team and your client, and helps to avoid promises that overshoot scope. This can also give a better understanding of the holes that your team might experience. This could be in technical expertise, such as a lack of strong 3D artists on the team, management or soft skills, and even experience in the subject matter of the client if that knowledge is available to you already. Having a solid foundation means knowing where it will break if stressed and ensuring that there are supporting pillars and backup plans in place to halt the entire project from collapsing. Making sure to outline each other's schedules is another crucial aspect of this meeting, especially for planning the upcoming client meeting and future meetings for both your team and client afterwards. Game development students don't get that much flexibility in the early years, but now that there are minors and electives being tossed around, your schedule may no longer line up as cleanly as they used to. Having a team member from another program will make this mandatory, as getting all schedules to line up will become much more challenging. A team that breaks down early is one that cannot meet and communicate often, so plan meetings accordingly. This should also take into account if there are any commuting students, and the team's willingness to have meetings through an online medium such as Zoom. There should be some in-person meetings if possible, but this is more of a personal preference. Find what works best for your team and stick with it. This all builds up your confidence and knowledge of each other so that you can gauge the best working habits for your team in the future and can best present your skill sets to the client at the upcoming meeting, which may have already been planned. If it hasn't, best to get on that quickly, because it's this meeting that can set up the entire semester for success or utter nonsensical frustration. No pressure, though. How do you assess what a client is wanting and the feasibility of its completion given your team? Congratulations, you have successfully met with your team and are now moving on to the next step, meeting with the client themselves. Before you do, make sure that all of your preparations that you painstakingly planned in the last section are in order, from friendly reminders of work expectations to deciding who should take the lead on conversations to help keep the meeting moving. You might also wish to do some background checks on the client so that you can gain some information on who they are and what their profession is. It'll help give expectations for what they may be looking for from you as a team of developers, and the area of questions that you might want to have ready to avoid confusion. If the client is outside of the industries that any team members are familiar with, having questions about their industry is even more important. Knowing any possible industry terminology or practices can help to bridge the gap of understanding between you and the client, and asking these questions shows that you value the client's expertise in their field. Meeting with the client can be daunting, so hopefully your preparations have calmed any nerves. But here's an important tidbit. You are on equal footing with your client. You are not working for them, you are working with them. It's a two-way street, even if the contract arrangements gives the impression that you are under them. This mindset is imperative to ensuring that conversations do not become too one-sided. They may not mean to, but as an industry professional, they may appear confident to the point of daunting to those outside of their industry or inexperienced with their work. The discussions that you'll have may include the client possibly bringing up deadlines or deliverables that, thanks to your preparations, you understand to not be feasible within the time frame that you are given. As the Capstone students, it is up to you to ensure that the client understands these limitations and stand firm on your inabilities to complete certain aspects of a project due to whatever constraints may exist, schooling or otherwise. You may feel pressured to simply accept any conditions in order to showcase your abilities, give a strong impression, or just because you think it is possible. If ever unsure, it is always best to bring up these concerns with the client and keep them posted if they need to be cut in the future. Be flexible but firm. You want both sides to leave this project with positive feelings, not grievances. So what exactly should you be discussing? In the broadest of senses, everything. Start with the focus on the project itself and pull apart every detail that you can. I'm talking timelines for the project, deliverables that are needed at those timeline dates, expectations of what the project could look like at the end, software to be utilized, terminology to be used. Anything and everything that could be thought of for the project should be fleshed out during this first initial meeting so that neither the client nor your team feel as if you don't understand what you are working on. Of course, not everything will be fleshed out perfectly, but don't be afraid to point out if there is something unclear about the project. Ensure that both parties know if there is something that needs to be worked on and discussed in a future meeting. Is the client offering any form of assistance or any specific kinds of restraints? Some clients may wish for your team to utilize certain software in order to create the project. Ensure that if the school doesn't cover it, that they are. Software and hardware is expensive, and as the development team, it is not your obligation to purchase items for a client unless it is part of the contract itself and has been approved by the school. If the client has these limitations, expect that they will have some way of getting your ability to work with them. This can also relate somewhat to skill sets as well. Does the client have a skill set that they can offer to assist, or might find useful as a reference while creating the product? This might be more obvious if the client is from outside of game development, but see if they know of resources or references that you can utilize to ensure that the project floats smoothly along. This segues into an extremely important conversation, the legality of everything. While none of us are lawyers, knowing what you can and cannot claim as your own is crucial to ensuring that there are no legal ramifications for the client, who will immediately come to you seeking answers. Just as you discussed what they are offering, discuss what they are not offering to you as developers, such as restrictions for what needs to be created from scratch and what can be acquired through other means. Again, try to avoid purchasing assets for the project unless actively specified to and given a budget, which goes outside the scope of this module. Consult your Capstone advisor if such conversations are brought up. Now, Do be aware that this legal conversation means that the documentation you will be providing as part of the deliverables will need to have any licenses and sources for anything that was not explicitly created by your team. This includes code. Everything you do not make yourself cannot be claimed as your own and needs to be cited. You've seen what happens when students are caught when it comes to academic plagiarism, but claiming assets as your own in a corporate world can be much less forgiving. Of course, I don't mean a line or two of code, but if you explicitly utilize a framework or an algorithm that solves your problem, ensuring that they are cited properly will keep your integrity in check and your client's mind at ease. This citation document will be a part of your deliverable list regardless of your product, and should be constantly updated with any new sources as you continue to build the product. Scrambling to find sources at the end can lead to wrongly citing assets and causing more confusion. Reminder once again, you are on equal footing with your client, as this goes for them as well. They cannot attempt to make you source something that wasn't theirs to begin with. Alright, what is a deliverable list? I've mentioned it a few times above, but knowing exactly what a deliverable list is when discussing it with the client is important. The term gets thrown around a bunch when talking in contract work, especially in software development, so let's set up a clear understanding for ourselves. Your deliverables are what you are delivering to the client's hand at the end of 12 weeks. This means everything that is given to them when your Capstone project finishes, from documentation to code to applications to written apologies. A deliverable list, then, is a written list of all of these deliverables that both you and your client have agreed upon to bring to them at the end of the given timeline, with possible milestones along the way if those are necessary. If there are milestones as part of the outline, try to line them up with your Capstone milestones as closely as possible. If this isn't possible, attempt to ensure that the milestones line up with your own team schedule instead. Better to have the team workflow unobstructed than constrict yourselves with too many timelines. This list should be made during that first meeting with the client and needs to be explicitly understood by both parties before leaving, so that you have a definitive understanding of what is to be given to the client. This needs to be as specific as possible, with as few vague statements such as "deliver a game" as possible. Everything that needs to be addressed should be addressed within this document. From those licenses from earlier that are going to be transferred over to the client to the submission format that the client needs the project to be given in. Nothing should be left to chance. You will be referring to this list repeatedly when talking to the client and your team in the future, and the client will be expecting that this list will be fulfilled by the end of the contract. If everything is not explicitly stated, this can cause issues with your team and your understanding of the project's goals with the client. It can lead to the client pushing extra work onto your team under the guise of vagueness, or a team member suggesting something out of scope that leads to the project being unable to meet deadlines. If you know what to submit at the end, you can work towards creating finite goals that can be easily viewed by the client, and if the deliverable list needs to be updated, a meeting should be discussed. By the way, as an aside, the deliverable list does not include you. This might sound odd, but you as student developers are not included in the deliverable list, nor should you be. When you hand off the project, it is no longer yours. It belongs to the client, and your input is no longer a factor. Handing over a project that is incomplete because you as developers believe that you would be supporting it after the contract date will result in a very unhappy client and a resounding disappointment from your Capstone. Now, there is an exception to this rule if a second agreement is made externally, but that is outside the scope of this Capstone and will not be discussed further. Speaking of Capstone, your deliverable list is a major part of the Capstone project itself, so make sure you don't create a verbal list with the client and just throw something together afterwards. Your teamwork, and Mark's, might not enjoy that. How do you talk about wrapping up the project to plan for its future? Now, we're reaching the end of the first meeting, and there's been a lot covered, but there is something that should be fleshed out a little bit more that was touched on earlier. The future of your project. While you as developers will not be a part of the project after the Capstone has completed, the client will be, and they need to determine not only what you are developing, but also what they plan to do with it after Capstone completes. Is this a finished project, like an application, something that is 100% completed upon the end of the timeline and should simply work? Is this a module that you are developing for an existing project, something that needs to slot in with a larger application that will require your ability to mesh with the existing data? Perhaps this project will be handed off to another team of developers, and it is your job to lay the foundation and framework for future developers to work within. Or maybe this is a live ops project that will need constant maintenance, not necessarily something that will be expanded upon, but require checkups to ensure data or work quality. All of this is information that can be gleaned while discussing the nature of the project, but should be an explicit talking point as it will determine your methodology for how you and your team will approach the workflow of the project, the level of documentation that is required, and what your deliverables may look like. It ties in nicely with the deliverable list. This can include the level of design documentation details required, code comment legibility, UML, or any other assets that you have created that may be needed depending on how the future of this project continues. For example, say you will be working on a project that involves the creation of an application that will be used by the company that the client represents, and they explicitly state that this application will be iterated on in the future and maintained. This is your indicator to know that your code legibility is essential to creating a proper product for the client. Comments need to be clean and precise, almost as if you will be teaching whomever reads your code how it all works from comments alone. While you can expect that whomever will take over will have some competency, that doesn't mean that you should be giving them nothing and expect them to figure it out. Of course, everyone codes in a specific flavor, and we've all received code that doesn't mesh well with our own the first time. You want to avoid frustration for those that are onboarding your work. This is just one example of many, and goes for all other assets as well. Artistic assets need to include mood boards and even references so that whomever will be attempting to blend their style with the new assets will have a good head start. Design documents help give the client's new team an understanding of your thinking and practices when designing future aspects of the project so that they do not attempt any designs that you know would clash from previous iterations. Any documentation related to the business plans needed to be included as well, if those are part of the contract, of course, as the client will want to see how you've created a plan for the project's adoption and for its marketability. Again, many of these assets are already utilized during creation, but it is up to your team to ensure that they are created in a way that can be viewed by other developers if necessary. I'll make sure to give this another reminder, but in case that you may have forgotten, you only have 12 weeks to complete this project. I know that there's a lot to unpack, and we haven't even gotten to the actual development phase itself, so it's important to have as much sorted out as possible to avoid downtime, especially if you start promising the moon and the stars. Ensure that this discussion occurs before you leave your client's first meeting, as attempting to sort this out afterwards may start to conflict with how you've set up your team workflow. There's obviously going to be some alterations or changes, so making sure that you've planned out as much as possible can help to mitigate them. How do you handle actually beginning the development? Well, you can all breathe a sigh of relief, for the first client meeting should now be complete. While it may not seem like much, many of you probably haven't handled contracts with individuals outside of school, which can be pretty stressful. Grab yourself a snack and contemplate all of the details that were described, because, as you might have guessed, we've only just begun. Now it's time for the part you are all familiar with, the development of the project itself. While there are too many possibilities for me to quantify, here are a few tips on how to stay on top of the contract and make your way through the school semester. The big thing that you all need to ensure occurs is to give updates. The client isn't going to magically assume that you are all performing swimmingly if you go AWOL for these 12 weeks, and it is one of the major complaints that clients have with new contractors. Decide how you will give your updates to the client, either through physical meetings or virtually in the future, and keep that schedule when giving your updates. Maintaining contact with them outside of meetings is also important, even if they are not the ones contacting you first. Take initiative if there are any issues during development that pertain specifically to the client that need to be resolved immediately, or are small issues that can be resolved within a few lines of text. Don't wait for milestone meetings to update the client on possible emergencies or waste their time. The client may have a specific method of contact or a time frame in which they can be contacted in. Use that when necessary and keep them posted during the times they request to ensure that there isn't any miscommunication. This doesn't mean to contact them incessantly about issues that they have nothing to do with. That's for Capstone. Just as you don't like to be pestered about things constantly, make sure you're not becoming a pest to them. For updates, make sure that you plan what you are going to say ahead of time. Don't just casually say whatever comes to mind. Ensure that you know what you want to update them on and what your next steps are moving forward. Think of it as presentations that you've given for school this far. The class and professors want the information to be given with confidence and proficiency, not someone rambling incessantly for hours on end. You and your client both value your own time. Don't waste it. And for the love of all things holy, don't lie to them. They will find out eventually. And not only will your credibility plummet through the floor, but your Capstone future won't look too bright either. If you know something isn't complete, be upfront and honest immediately. There might be some friction, but that's better than assumptions of everything being clear, only for it to come crashing down at the end. Talk with Capstone if this friction between you and your client reaches a level in which communication begins to break down, as at that point you might require mediation. Friendly reminder as well for these meetings that, unlike school presentations, your client isn't your friend or your colleague. Keep all levels of contact as professional as possible, respecting their wishes for communication and discussion. Even casual questions and conversations should be kept with a professional edge to maintain a proper relationship between the two parties. Now, that was a lot about the client, but in terms of the teams that you are in, make sure to schedule meetings outside of the client meetings. This might sound painfully obvious, but it can be easily swept aside in the currents of schooling and other meetings. This is why the meeting before the client is so important, so that you can all make sure that you won't just disappear for weeks. There are many styles and ways of scheduling and handling these team meetings, so make sure to find out a method that works for you all and stick with it. Create milestones of your own and goals for each member, having a set understanding of the work each member will do during the time between meetings. This also means keeping meeting minutes for professional conduct, which can also help keep you all on track. Consider assigning one member as a project manager to keep track of all team members' progress, as well as enforcing meetings and presentations. We all like to believe that we can all work in parallel perfectly, but that isn't always possible. Understand that when scheduling these meetings and milestones, that any new skills or technology that you may need to learn should be planned for as well. While you may all be confident in your skill acquisition ability, it will still take time that you may consider out of development. This is part of the development process, and should be scheduled as such so that the person learning this new skill isn't scrambling to finish their assigned work in time for any upcoming meeting. Don't get overconfident. Leave yourselves buffers so that you aren't always scrambling. Even more reason to understand your team's skills before starting the project. As you progress through the year, always make sure to refer to the documentation that was created during that first meeting with the client, specifically the deliverable list. That's the other reason why we created after all, helping you understand what you are working towards at any given time without needing to constantly contact the client. This is also why you want to keep it clean and concise, so that you don't scratch your head at the wording of a certain framework and ending up spending weeks on an element that isn't necessary. You'll only be blaming yourselves at that point. Well, that's a lot of information to parse through, isn't it? Contract work can feel extremely stressful and jarring at first, like you are without a tether to pull in case of emergency. But by keeping professional in communication and a cool head, you can ensure that these 12 weeks will be successful for your team. Hopefully this guide was able to help you plan for how you wish to approach your project this year, especially during moments where you feel uncertain about what paths you may take in this new environment. While there are too many variables to account for, you should now be able to plan your path accordingly. If you have any questions that couldn't be answered by this module or are hyper-specific to your situation, seek out your Capstone representative during an allotted time. I have full confidence in your ability to succeed, so good luck on your Capstone project.